back to make his presentation. And with that, I will introduce the session, our presenter, and the aims of the Financial History Network. So hello to all. My name is Manuel Bautista Gonzalez. I used to be, until this month, a PhD candidate at the University of Columbia. And I'm happy to let you all know that that limbo has ended and I am now a doctor. And I will now be moving on to the University of Oxford, so that affiliation will change as a postdoctoral researcher. And I am very happy to have you all here today. I am a founding convener of the Financial History Network, alongside with my colleagues, Miguel López Morel from the University of Murcia, Sergio Castellanos Gamboa from the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Colombia, now the secretary-elect of the Colombian Economic and Business History Association, which makes us really happy. And Paula Bedobelli, not last but not least, and most importantly, our colleague and the friend and the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Sao Paulo. So the core group that founded this network is here. We're only missing our colleague Bernardo Batis, but he sends his regards to all of you. So the network, the webinar series this year opens with a lecture by Professor Didac Queralt, based on his book, Pawned States. I am going to introduce Didac, and then he will have 30 minutes to make a keynote talk about his book. We ask you all to please raise your hand, or if you want to make a comment at the end of his lecture. We will have 30 minutes of questions and answers. We prefer when people ask their questions themselves, sharing their video and their sound, so that this feels more like a conversation, less of a usual web panel. But if for any reason you don't want to share your screen or your video, please type your question on the chat and we will read them for Didac to answer. That being said, also, so I'm going to read his present. This is a brief biographical blurb, and then I'll give him the floor. So thank you all again for being here. Thank you, Didac. Didac Queralt is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Yale University. His research lies at the intersection of comparative and international political economy, with a focus on the origins of fiscal institutions from three different angles: war, trade, and political competition. Queralt earned a BA in political science at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona and a PhD in political science at New York University. Queralt's recent work includes a book, Pawned States, State Building in the Era of International Finance, published by Princeton University Press this year. In this book, Queralt traces the long-term effects of international finance on state capacity and limited government. Queralt has published articles in the American Journal of Political Science, International Organization, the Quarterly Journal of Political Science, International Studies Quarterly, and Comparative Political Studies. Professor Queralt's ongoing projects center on colonial finance, sovereign default, political order, and survival. So, and with that being said, for those of you who who are members of the Financial History Network mailing list, FinHisNet, you will have received a Princeton University Press leaflet with a discount code. So please, if you're interested in today's talk, feel free to use it. We don't get a commission, by the way, we just want to promote the book. So without much further ado, please, Queralt, the floor is yours. I'll let you know when you have 5 minutes remaining.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and congratulations on your doctoral degree, which is always something to be celebrated. And I'm very happy for the invitation, the opportunity to share this book with you, with economic historians. So I'm a political scientist in training, and it's always a little bit intimidating to present this work to experts in the field, but at the same time, it is very exciting. Let me see, just one, yeah. this should work. Okay, so if I had to summarize this book in one phrase, it would be that early access to external public credit weakened the incentives to build state institutions in the global south. And that's basically the main summary of this book, which is based on a previous article that I published in International Organization in 2019, in which I look specifically at how external war was financed with foreign capital in the 19th century, and how that basically had consequences for fiscal capacity in the short and long run. So in the book, what I do is to elaborate on the political calculations of home rulers, of basically incumbents, to basically to examine under what circumstances they would prefer to float loans overseas rather than financing government with domestic resources. And as it will become pretty apparent that the decision is very consequential for the short and long term welfare of the state. I then also examine the mechanisms of transmission, basically why early decisions about how government is financed have lasting consequences. And also I characterize in the book the very early global financial market in the 19th century, and that's basically the focus of today's talk. Usually this slide is for my political scientist fellows who might not know as much as you do about international finance in the 19th century. Basically, this is the first global capital market in history. All countries participate in this market. We have the European markets, but also we have the European economies, but also the newly independent republics in Latin America. We also have traditionally isolated countries in Asia, and we have the colonies, and all these actors are participating in this global market. And the puzzle that basically motivates the first chapters of the book is to understand why, despite the weak economic and political fundamentals of many of these countries, and why, despite the frequent episodes of default, these economies had access to relatively cheap external capital in European markets. And the preview of the answer to this question is that the investors that were based in Western Europe, the foreign lenders, were able to reduce the risk of lending to these newcomers in capital markets by imposing what I call extreme conditionality in loan contracts. And these are basically obligations to collateralize public assets and sources of revenue in order to gain access to fresh capital. And these obligations had consequences because in case of default, those assets that had been pledged would be foreclosed by international investors. So parts of the book, important parts of the book articulate the reasons why those contracts were enforceable, and I will talk about this in the talk. And I also advance some empirical evidence that sustains the idea of, or lends support to the idea of extreme conditionality. So with this book, I try to talk and speak to different literatures. The first one is the theories of the spread, and I'm sure that you are familiar with the explanations that basically relate to reputation concerns, empire effects belonging to the empire, and also the role of the gold standard. This idea of extreme conditionality is not meant to substitute any of the existing theories, but I try to advance a fourth main explanation for why we find this secular decrease in the price of capital, despite the frequent episodes of default. The execution of extreme conditionality resonates with the idea of super sanctions, this idea that was coined by Michener and Weidenmayer in 2005. If you know that work, basically those authors claim that in case of default, the borrowers would basically be subject to a receivership and gunboat diplomacy, but that it happened on an exposed basis and on a very individual basis, right? Rather than being a generalized policy. What I argue in this book is that those super sanctions and actually the extreme conditionality that actually opened the floor for super sanctions was a generalized practice. They became part of the rules of the game, and they shaped expectations about how loans had to be floated and what were the consequences of defaulting on sovereign loans. And that is going to explain this general decline of the spread. There are two other literatures that I seek to contribute with this book. One is the old discussion on financial imperialism, which was popularized as the Hobson-Lane hypothesis, which I find persuading up to some extent. I find it one-sided in the sense that it largely dismisses the domestic politics that help explain why borrowing countries prefer to finance government overseas rather than domestically. So what I do in this book is to elaborate a political economy of government finance, in which I have rulers, incumbents, deciding whether to pay for government with external funds or domestic funds, and I identify conditions under which external finance is preferable. And basically, I can draw predictions about what are the consequences of financing the state with foreign capital when those conditions are met. And to conclude, I seek to contribute to the state building literature by basically encouraging all the researchers in this field to consider the interaction between taxes and debt and sovereign debt, because most of the foundational or canonical work that we all are familiar with treat taxes and debt as complements. Basically, the idea is that one reinforces the other. And what I argue in this book is that Ricardian equivalence of public finance cannot hold necessarily in open economies if debt is not repaid in tax money, but is repaid in specie, right? So when borrowers repay their loans by handing over state assets to global investors, they are eroding the tax base, and because of that, they are going to need new loans, and that might push some economies to debt traps and to weak states and possibly autocratic politics. So once I have contextualized the book and what I try to do in this book, let me tell you what comes next in the presentation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the rise of public credit and some data sets that I've put together to characterize this early global financial market. Then I will tell you a little bit more about extreme conditionality and offer some quantitative evidence that supports the notion of extreme conditionality, holding everything else constant. And I will conclude with some implications that speak to the lasting or long-term consequences of early access to external capital. So, as you probably know, before the 19th century, the international capital market was relatively small. Basically, it was centered in Amsterdam, and it was restricted to a handful of European countries. So, out of every 4 loans, 3 of them went from Amsterdam to London. So we can think of this international capital market as very small, existing, but very small. And that changes radically after 1815, when London becomes the new financial capital of the world, the world's banker. And that's because there is this surplus of the Industrial Revolution that basically is floating around, and these capitalists decide to invest their money overseas. And this means that what we have in this early credit market, which is different from the current credit market, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, is a collection of capitalists, of private financiers that lend money to borrowing countries that will spend that capital in building military, in investing in infrastructure, and repaying all their debt. So I'm not the first one that speaks about that talks about this early credit market. And particularly, I'm not the first one that claims that this was a big thing. So Aiken Green has estimated the size of these international flows to be 3 times larger in 1880 than in 1980 relative to the world GDP. And this capital before 1914 really reached every corner of the world. So all the countries, all the colonies had access to external finance, and we need to understand what are the consequences of that. So to shed some initial light about the conditions under which this capital was negotiated, I put together a data set on sovereign lending with based on new quotations in primary market. These quotations were basically, these loans were floated in London, and this data set covers a period between 1816 and 1913. And together, I put together data for 92 polities in Europe, new countries, new independent countries, all countries outside Europe, and colonies, and that brings us to 940 plus sovereign bonds. So the first test or the first basically figure that I want to share with you is one in which I plot the average nominal interest rate before and after 1815. So for the data before the 800, I rely on David Stasavage's 2011 book. And basically I plot this curve that gives us what is the average interest rate. And then I basically append the new data set after 1816. And what we see in this figure is that there is no structural break after the arrival of new players to the capital markets. That means that the interest rates and the conditions that were negotiated over 500 years in Western Europe are basically transposed directly to the new lenders, despite them having very different economic and political fundamentals. Now, this is a zoom of the 19th century. Here, what I do is I plot the average nominal rate for countries outside Western Europe and countries in Western Europe. What we see is at the beginning of the period, the spread between both groups was about 100 basis points, and that the spread vanishes by the end of the 19th century. When we look at the effective interest rate, which is calculated at issue, what we see is that, leaving Australia aside, every country or every region in the world basically paid effectively at issue at the same rate. So all these rates were within one percentage point, which effectively means that everybody paid roughly the same, despite the very different economic and political profiles of these borrowing countries. So to conclude this first part of the presentation, I just want to emphasize that we have this massive flow of private capital to public hands. That this money was relatively cheap in historical terms, and when we compare the rates across space. The cheap money was not compensated with short maturities. On the other hand, these maturities were very long, so countries had a priori a long time to repay. And the question that basically comes across naturally is why this money was so cheap despite the weak fundamentals and these recurrent episodes of default, right? How did investors compensate for that risk? And what I claim is that they did so by imposing extreme conditionality on the loan contracts. Remember that I mean by extreme conditionality, this obligation to pledge public assets as collateral in loan contracts, and that in case of default, that collateral would be foreclosed by the private bondholders, and they would manage the local asset until the debt was liquidated. And of course, when I say this, there are many questions that flow naturally. The first one is, which kind of assets were pledged? How often did foreclosure occur? Did the lenders benefit from the foreclosure? How did the lenders enforce the foreclosure? And of course, from the domestic point of view, why did borrowing countries accept extreme conditionality? So next, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of these questions, and I want to direct you to the second chapter of the book if you are interested in the domestic politics of accepting extreme conditionality. So what kind of assets were pledged? Well, there were basically two types of assets. One type of asset was the tax administration itself. So it could be, for instance, all the receipts from a province or a branch of the tax administration, like the customs office, and they received the name of receivership. But also state monopolies, tobacco, salt, copper, were pledged and foreclosed. And I refer to those as debt equity swaps. So those receiverships basically involve bondholders or representatives of the bondholders taking over the local tax administration and running it until the debt was liquidated. Others have referred to this type of intervention as foreign financial control or fiscal house arrest. And there are examples of this kind of intervention everywhere around the globe. So there is no concentration of receiverships in any particular part of the globe. And the same basically happens with the debt equity swaps. These are usually state monopolies, state companies, or land that are handed over foreign investors after default. And that happened again in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, everywhere around the globe, and these bondholders would basically focus on the main money cows of the borrowing countries. So, how frequent were these exchanges? So, the best estimate that we have is given by Michener and Weidenmayer. They find that receiverships alone happened in 28% of the default episodes. That means that 1 out of 2 borrowers in the 19th century experience a form of receivership at any point. That number raised to 70% in case of a previous default. So the countries that defaulted more than once had a probability above 2/3 to experience one of these receiverships. And this estimate is very valuable, but we have to understand that it is only a conservative number because it focuses only on receiverships, not debt equity swaps, not exchanges of all debt for state monopolies, which I argued earlier that were very frequent. And this estimate does not account for what I call preemptive foreclosure. In the sense that countries that were already having a hard time repaying would negotiate before default one of these exchanges, and they would receive fresh capital, but at the same time they would handle over those assets to international investors, and that again happened in several countries before 1914. So the next question that comes naturally is how foreign investors that did not have a military were able to impose such an extreme sanction on borrowers all around the country, all around the globe. And what I argue in chapter 4 of the book is that there were 3 conditions that were met in the second half of the 19th century that made extreme conditionality enforceable. Those conditions are coordination of foreign investors, also that there is an elite replacement within the British government, and there is also an intensification of great power or imperial competition that aligns the interest of the financial sector with the national interest of the country. So how much time do I have left?
You just crossed the 9 minute, actually 10-minute line.
Okay, so so how did the bondholders gain this coordination capacity? So probably most of you know that they created the Corporation of Foreign Bondholders in 1868. This was an organization based in London that specialized in default settlement negotiation with embarrassed countries that had defaulted their debt or had not been paying their debt on a regular basis. So this organization brought together for the first time small and large bondholders. So these bondholders had very different preferences. So the smaller investors, basically individuals that would invest their personal savings on foreign loans, wanted to impose very harsh conditions on borrowers because they wanted to recover all their money. Right? These are basically all their money is at stake, and they want to get it all back. The large bondholders, on the other hand, which are the major underwriters, favored softer conditions for a faster recovery. They basically were in the business of basically signing new loan contracts. So they wanted to terminate exclusion as fast as possible and basically dynamize the lending market again. So for the first time, this Corporation of Foreign Bondholders see both kind of investors on the same table, and they gain this negotiation capacity versus the borrowing countries. But that's not the only thing that this corporation did. It also facilitated lobbying, unified lobbying for diplomatic assistance by the Foreign Office. And there are several examples in the chapter about how they organize, how basically they approach prominent political figures in Britain to advance the interest of the financial sector in some default settlement episode. So there are also questions about what the British government wants and why they are receptive to lobbying by private investors. And the reason for that is based on a process of elite replacement within the British government, the executive, and also a context of imperial competition between basically Britain, France, and Germany. So for the elite replacement, I draw the explanation from the work of Kynes and Hopkins and Cassis, among others, who basically document the switch in sectoral specialization of the British aristocratic elite, which basically after the repeal of the Corn Laws noticed that their land doesn't basically is worthless, and they have this money that they decide to put in the financial sector, in the banking sector. Others, instead of becoming bankers, join the government, and they join high-ranking positions, or they occupied high-ranking positions in the Foreign Office, in the Colonial Office, in the Bank of England, which was critical for British public credit, and also they take consular delegations, the leadership of consular delegations all around the globe. So basically, you have this aristocratic elite being represented in the banking sector, in the Bank of England, in the government, and also are the people that talked or overseas with representatives of foreign governments. And basically, they are the ones that often negotiate the parts of these default settlements. So there is a natural alignment between the interest of the financial sector and the interest of the country as a whole, as a result of this elite replacement. And we also need to understand that these loans and the default settlements did not happen in the vacuum. They happened in a context of increasingly rough competition between the major powers in the West. And that basically meant, empirically, that the initial doctrine of the British government to stay away from loan contracts was relaxed over time, and that more and more often the British government accepted to intervene and to send diplomatic notes to meet with foreign dignitaries to negotiate on behalf of the private investors the resolution of default settlements or the negotiations of fresh capital. And
5 minutes.
The reasons for that is pretty straightforward. We need to understand that 2/3 of British private capital in the second half of the 19th century is invested overseas. So basically, the future of the country is at stake, and there is also basically a geopolitical consideration in place. We need to understand that France and Germany were very open in using finance as an imperial policy. They would basically negotiate on behalf of private investors new loans, and in case of default settlements, they would sit in the table. And the British government at some point has to abandon this no intervention policy and jump into the negotiations and work together with British investors. So basically, we have these three conditions that are happening at the same time, which increase the credibility of extreme conditionality and the foreclosure in case of default. And this is basically recognized by prominent intellectuals and also politicians in the global South, like Drago himself. I'm sure that you have heard about the Drago doctrine. So he brought very explicitly that even in the 1907, even almost basically touching World War I, military intervention in case of a default was still considered a legitimate course of action. Okay, so these contracts were credible. So one way to test for that is to look at the role of pledges on interest rates. If pledges are credible, if they are enforceable, we should see interest rates going down in loan contracts that include pledges, right? And that happens because those pledges might reduce the risk of default. We can think of these swaps being considered as a national humiliation, and leaders don't want that because that's not good for their tenure in office. But if default happens, these pledges are going to be executed, right? Because of extreme conditionality. So one way or another, the lenders are going to regain their investment. So to test for the role of pledges, I digitized the prospectus collection of the London Stock Exchange. I basically coded the 707 loans for 90 countries between 1858 and 1914. I looked at the prospectus of this collection of loans, and I coded whether they included a specific pledge. And here I was looking at tobacco monopolies, customs office, railways, land, etc. So I focus on specific pledges rather than general pledges because that's basically a rhetorical resource. So what the data shows is that 27% of the bonds floated in this particular time in the London Stock Exchange included a specific pledge, and that number raises up to 50% of the bonds for countries that were not part of the empire. So 1 out of 2 loans had one of those specific pledges. This is an example of the kind of material that I digitized. You can find more examples in the book. And the question is how I model the enforcement or enforceability of pledges and their impact on interest rates. So as I mentioned, pledges are credible only when bondholders can enforce them. And I mentioned that capacity grew over time. So what I do is I run a simple interaction model with the presence of the pledge interacted with a year, and I use that to model interest rates. And I also feed country fixed effects to compare apples to apples. And then I also take advantage of the adoption of the Corporation of Foreign Bondholders to see whether there is a change in enforceability before and after the creation of this organization. And basically, I also run this kind of model. But rather than going into the specifics, I'm going to share one of the figures that summarize the results. Here, what we see is two predicted curves for the interest rate. One for loans that included a specific asset, that's the line in red. And then we have the line in blue, which is for loans that didn't include any specific pledge. What we see is that the beginning of the sample, when pledges are still non-credible, having one of those pledges in a loan contract actually signal weakness, right? Basically, countries that would not be able to pay would collateralize everything. But they did that because they knew that those contracts were not enforceable. But that changes over time. And what we see is that starting in the mid 1870s, when we have the corporation already, when we have the intensification of great power competition, those pledges become credible, and we see that there is no difference in the interest rate paid by for loans that included a pledge or not. So what are the implications of extreme conditionality? Well, the implication is that these receiverships and these debt equity swaps would put in the hands of foreign bondholders the main sources of revenue of countries in the global periphery, and that would erode the tax base. And that means that in order to fund government, these countries would need to float new loans. But they had a smaller tax base to repay, and the chances of defaulting again would increase. And this basically can push some economies into debt traps or persistent fiscal imbalances that have lasting consequences on state capacity in the long run. And that's basically the second part of the book, about which I'm not going to say anything. Happy to comment on it in the Q&A. But basically, that second part of the book analyzes what is the effect of foreign financial control. And basically, I find that there is no, I'm going to be that in a second, there is no positive effect on local fiscal capacity in any of these instances of foreign financial control, and that we can trace state weakness today, measured based on tax capacity and the size of the tax administration, on how often and how much countries in the global periphery funded or financed externally between 1816 and 1914. And for that, I offer some quantitative evidence, but also a collection of case studies that illustrates different paths to state building, some leading to actual state capacity, others leading to state weakness. And I'm very happy to tell you about that in the Q&A. And with that, I'm going to leave it here, and I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Didac, for your presentation. And I invite everyone who might have a question to either raise your hands or using the reactions feature on Zoom. I do have one question in the queue by Kyle Jackson, and I'm going to read it. So if there are no other questions, you might feel free to answer it. And if not, we will gather 3 questions. Okay, Pilar also raised her hand. So we will have Kyle, Pilar, and then somebody else's question. Kyle asks, to what extent do you believe the pledges were intended purely as a financial instrument, i.e. to ensure repayment of debt, versus a strategic tactic intended to seize assets or concessions based on the expectation that default was likely. In other words, were the debt traps intended by the lenders to be a trap? So that's Kyle's question. And now Pilar, please feel free to unmute.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much, Didac, for the presentation. It's really interesting. My question is related mainly the meaning of state building here in this context, because basically the idea you explain about extreme conditionality and collateralization and so on. So I was thinking that in the early modern period, European states based debt on the same kind of collateral on state monopolies, customs, and so on. So, and however, they were very successful in terms of state building. So my question is, when we talk about state building here, what I miss, mainly it's in the book, but what I miss is to look at more in detail the side of expenditures. Because basically the idea is, I'm thinking in Latin America, if you invest in infrastructures, so you should spend a higher GDP and therefore a higher revenue collection. If you spend in war, then the result is not so clear, but also thinking in Europe in the early modern period, it was very successful war in order to build the state. So what I miss is this side of expenditure, how this money was used, and to what extent. And related to that, I also miss in your story the differences between independent countries and colonies, because for colonies, and here again coming back to the side of expenditures, so we can spend some extractive behavior. I know the fiscal budget for India, for instance. So it was very extractive. So this is going to have an impact too in terms of state building. And for independent states, I find a problem of endogeneity here, right? Because you are a weak state, so you cannot increase taxation, and so it's not the causality is not so clear for me. So this is mainly my question. One is what is happening with expenditures and the impact on growth and therefore tax collection, and the differences between colonial states and independent states in terms of state building. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pilar. I have one third question by Paula. Then you can answer the questions.
Okay.
Thank you, Didac. I have a number of questions that I think I'm going to follow up on Kyle's and Pilar's questions regarding to Kyle's question. I was wondering if these pledges were actually a way of sovereign borrowers to bargain with international financiers, because most of this, at least in the Latin American context, most of these pledges were defined in the legislation that established the conditions for a loan issue. So they were not necessarily established by the financiers like the Rothschild, the Barings, and etc. So I was wondering if this was a way of playing with the expectations that these pledges would decrease sovereign risk, although recent work by Malak Labib shows that actually when they were trying to seize the assets or go after the monopolies, there were a lot of knowledge challenges to look at the books and negotiate during the bargain. So I'm trying to look at the side of sovereign borrowers, how they play off against the system to get more advantages. And regarding Pilar's questions, I was also a bit confused about the meaning of state building, because you apply a very European-oriented meaning of state building, which uses as a proxy of state building the development of state capacity, which is anchored on fiscal capacity. But if you look, for example, at nearly independent states like Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Chile, state building may mean just the making of elite consensus, right? So how you ensure elite consensus, especially in closed access states like Argentina and Brazil, or how you do public finance, how do you reduce the costs of public finance facing distributive politics, right? So perhaps if we look at state building from a different definition, a different perspective, then these choices are more rational, right, than we think. They might be less optimal in the sense of the model you build in the book. I have more questions, but I would like to hear your answer and colleagues' comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. So Didac, the floor is yours.
Yeah. So I have well, thank you for the comments. I have in the book a section called "Betting on Default," right, in which I discuss whether there was an explicit plan to lend to countries that they knew would default, to take over the assets, rather than using collateralization as a way to minimize risk. So I don't want to go that far because I cannot show evidence that that is the case. There are things that, there are always anecdotes that you can read. There were also reports or investigation committees in the British Parliament that suggest that some lenders were not being faithful, that they were betting on default. There's also some evidence that sinking funds, for instance, did not help to reduce interest rates, whereas pledges did. And that might make you think that pledges were more valued than other forms of risk reduction. But I, to be honest, and I cannot go that far and make that kind of claim. That should be explored in a different project with probably different kind of data. In terms of the collateralization, so Pilar, you might know more about finance in the early modern period than I do, but one of the things that distinguishes state building or public credit in Europe from public credit in the rest of the world is that most of that credit in Europe came from domestic lenders. And that changes everything because that increases the cost of default very significantly. And that kind, when you borrow from domestic sources, chances are that you are also going to share some power with those resources. And I'm not meaning a parliament. I'm meaning mechanisms through which the domestic creditors can make sure that the monarch, in this case, is using the money for the right purposes. So that's basically one of the things that I try to argue in the book, that we should think of, when we think about dealing, we cannot transpose the theory that is basically thought for a world without international credit markets to a world that has mainly international credit markets, because the incentives of rulers, the incentives of people that make these decisions are completely different in both settings. And that opens new paths of state building. Now, in terms of the expenditure, I focus in empirical analysis on war expenditure, on war-based expenditure, because that was the majority of the bigger part of the expenditure. So it is true that there are some countries, and they always the same names come up, Brazil and Argentina, that invested in infrastructure, and they grew, and basically you have these forward linkages that are very good, that railroads are very good. But even in those countries, we don't observe any evidence of backward linkages. And there are, for each of those examples, you can find dozens of examples in which railroads were not conducive to economic growth or tax yields, basically because the railroads were not rationally planned. They were basically opportunities for foreign investors to make money. They were not opportunity for nations to grow capacity. So I'm very skeptical of the role of the railroad to build states in the global periphery, because that the conditions under which those networks were planned and were financed are far from the conditions under which one would expect positive outcomes. In terms of the differences between colonies and independent countries, in terms of collateralization, yes, you are absolutely right that colonies are different animals. And actually, in a test that I didn't show, I find that everything that I find about the role of pledges actually comes from independent countries. Colonies, some of them pledge some asset at some point, but basically this is an argument that applies only to independent nations. And you said, well, but independent nations and collateralization can be endogenous, right? So I agree. I agree with that. But again, 70% of independent nations collateralize at some point. And when you have that empirically, you can. There's as much as you can do. So what I do is I control for as many initial conditions as possible in the empirical analysis. I also run these country fixed effects, and I basically exploit these sudden stops to basically gain leverage on the conditions under which countries access international markets, right? So I do everything in my capacity to address those endogeneity questions. In terms of, so now to Paula. So there were several questions there. One was how borrowers took advantage in the negotiations. So what I argue in the second chapter when I elaborate on the political economy is to basically show that countries with weaker political institutions, meaning weaker tax capacity at the beginning and more autocratic governments, were were those that were most likely to accept this kind of condition. So basically, borrowers knew that those autocrats would have a disproportionately large cost of not floating funds. If those autocrats wanted to raise money domestically, they would have to share powers with domestic elites. And we know that, for instance, in Latin America, there is a lot of basically problems of legitimacy problems of central rulers with regional rulers. And domestic rulers, I mean, the central rulers didn't want to negotiate with regional rulers, and that's precisely why they were more likely to finance war, which could be domestic war, civil war, or external war, or infrastructure with external credit. In terms of the definition of state building, I would need you to remind me, because I made a note, I would need you to remind me what was about the definition of state building in the book, which is basically the capacity to, I focus on fiscal capacity in particular. What about that does not travel to other parts of the world?
I just posted in the comment, but instead of focusing on state capacity, perhaps focusing on the production of elite consensus. So, for example, my question would be, perhaps in times of war, you were saying that incumbents or rulers do not want to negotiate with regional elites, but in the case of Brazil and Argentina during the Paraguayan War, what we see is exactly the opposite. And they do this via foreign loans and domestic loans, because both Argentina and Brazil has had domestic markets, including foreign investors invested in domestic loans. So I was wondering if the need to keep these states together were more important than the need to make them able to deliver public goods, especially if you think that the taxpayers are also members of the elite who not necessarily want to put their money into the public goods provision, but also want to derive rents from taxes.
Yeah, so I know a little better the Argentinian case. So basically, before 1870s, when there is this massive influx of external capital, Argentina was doing everything that a state builder should do, right? Basically, you have this passing of a liberal constitution, you have an increase in tax capacity, you have compromise between elites, but that changes radically after 1870s. You have this massive influx of external capital that is invested in the railroads, it is invested in the banking sector, and that distorts entirely state building in that country. And basically, 20 years later, Argentina is a net exporter of capital, which is basically the result of foreign investors taking over everything that made money in that country. And that's basically one of the. It's a good example of, and it's one of the cases in the book that this access to external finance is very tempting because it helps you to solve a lot of problems. Like you said, like you want to keep this country together. Yes, but maybe that's not the right way to keep the country together by allowing others to pay the bill. Maybe the best way to keep a country together is to create a strongly federal structure in which the center is very weak relative to the regions, right? But that means that the central ruler loses control entirely. And those are the kind of negotiations that might allow us to explain why countries go one path or another.
Thank you, Didac. So we have two questions, one by Rohan Advani, the other one by Con Keating, and then I think we can wrap up the session. Rohan, if you want to go on.
Hi, Didac. Hi, thanks so much for this presentation. I found it very useful. So I just wanted to ask you more about the question of inter-imperial competition. So I'm not an economic historian, so hopefully I got what you were saying was correct, but you seem to suggest that pledges acted as a way in lieu of basically keeping interest rates down, right? They acted as a way to keep interest rates down. And secondly, that the consolidation of gentlemen classes and inter-imperial competition made contracts more enforceable. But theoretically, could it work in reverse, in the sense that in a context of inter-imperial competition, could borrowing states also not play powers against each other for more favorable conditions? And secondly, could inter-imperial competition and the rise of gentlemanly classes and more finance capital across different imperial states also serve as a causal explanation for why interest rates were basically maintained relatively low, in the sense that there were more and more access to credit, basically? As in, it was just not Britain, but one could borrow from other countries too. Thanks.
Should I? So
Con, just to make
Yeah.
Sure. First, let me offer you a comment. If you want to look at debt trap type arrangements, I think you should be looking more to direct lending than public bond issues, for the obvious reasons. The other thing which surprises me is that you've made no mention at all of one of the Council for the Protection of Foreign Bondholders' principal weapons in ensuring enforcement and resolving debts which are delinquent, that was denial of access to the London market. I was involved in precisely that when we finally negotiated the settlement with the Chinese and allowed them access to the London markets again.
Okay, so so let me go in order. So if I understood, so Rohan, you meant that the borrowers could play one great power against another to avoid having to pledge?
Yeah, was that possible? Like, was that a thing that had happened or anything like that?
Well, what I can tell you is that pledges became more frequent over time. Basically, because this is not a negotiation between equals, and the weak have to accept the conditions of the strong. So there are some, for instance, Japan made everything in its ability not to allow international investors to put money on domestic infrastructure. They only floated loans for the military. And the reason that they did that is that they knew what happened in Egypt and other places, and they didn't want to open that possibility for international investors, right? So they could do a little bit of that, but again, that was very, very limited. And Japan could do that because it had that very strong domestic credit market to begin with, right? And it could fund the infrastructure. So basically, it's Japan and Brazil. Those are like the two countries with strong domestic credit markets. All of the other countries in the world have very weak credit markets, and so what we see in terms of who lends. So most of the lending happened in the UK, and you see France in late 1870s. France begins to lend more, and Germany also. But the main player all throughout the period is Britain, and that's like the main player. And the other ones are very basically aggressive in linking imperial policy and financial policy because they are underdogs. So they have to go very much with everything that they have, right? And the British initially said, okay, it's okay, we are not going to do that, but eventually they do the same. Right? In the early 20th century, they basically do the same. And for the exclusion, yeah. So the exclusion was always there, and exclusion was basically perfected from the very beginning, from 1820s. Countries were excluded if they defaulted. But the thing is that that was quite inefficient in solving default settlements. And basically, you see that until the creation of the Corporation of Bondholders, these negotiations, the default settlements could last 30, 40 years. And that number decreases radically after the creation of the corporation, because they find ways in which they can say, okay, if you default, we're going to exclude you, but we're going to rapidly regain, we are going to allow you to rapidly regain access to international credit markets. Why? Because we are basically taking over parts of your tax base directly. We're going to run it directly. So yes, exclusion is there, but exclusion is not the only mechanism that investors have to basically make borrowers do whatever they want.
Thank you.
Well, with that, I want to please thank you all for attending, and thank you, Didac, for your very interesting presentation. There is plenty of things more left to discuss, as is usual when we have an audience of financial historians. We want to get into the case studies, and I think the merit of your work is precisely to provide a framework with which to test each and every one of the stories and the national case studies that we study. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. And I hope that you like the book.
Thank you.
Which
yes, please remember.
Briefcases.
Please remember, if you need the discount code, feel free to reach out to us at financialhistorynetwork@gmail.com. We are able to provide you with the Princeton University Press leaflet. We don't get a commission, and you know, global inflation rising, so it always comes useful to have a little bit of a discount. So thank you all for attending, and we're going to stop the recording now, and we're just going to stay here for a while just to talk informally. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for being here.